Have you ever just stopped and wondered about the incredible journey a child's mind takes? I mean, how does a newborn, this tiny person, transform into a complex individual with their own thoughts, feelings, and a moral compass? It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really boils down to this huge question, right? How does a baby's brain become a mind? It feels like it should be magic, but it turns out it's a process, a journey. And we've actually got a map to help us understand it.
And luckily for us, some absolute pioneers dedicated their entire lives to figuring this out. We're going to look at the groundbreaking ideas of three of the heaviest hitters in this field: Jean Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and Lev Vygotsky.
So let's dive in. Let's explore the story of how a child's mind grows, but we'll see it through the eyes of these three brilliant thinkers.
First up, we've got Jean Piaget, a true giant in psychology. His idea was totally revolutionary at the time. He said, look, kids aren't just empty buckets that we pour knowledge into. No, he saw them as little scientists, constantly out there exploring, testing, and building their own picture of how the world works.
So how do they actually do this? Well, Piaget said they use something called a schema. The easiest way to think about a schema is like a mental blueprint, or maybe a little file folder in the brain. When a kid figures out a new puzzle, boom, they create a schema for it. Every single new thing they experience, they're either trying to fit it into a file they already have, or they're forced to create a brand new one. It's the absolute building block of how we think.
Piaget laid this all out in 4 distinct stages. First, from birth to about 2 years old, you have the sensory motor stage. Here, a baby's entire universe is built through their senses: touching, tasting, seeing. Then, from 2 to 7, they hit the pre-operational stage. This is when language and imagination just explode. But their logic is, well, it's still a bit quirky. From 7 to 11, they're in the concrete operational stage, getting way more logical, but mostly about stuff they can see and touch. And finally, from 11 onward, they enter the formal operation stage. And this is where they can start to think abstractly and about what-if scenarios. It's this incredible roadmap of our own mental growth.
Okay, here's a classic example from that pre-operational stage. You take a ball of Play-Doh, show it to a little kid, and then you squish it into a flat pancake. 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you the pancake is more Play-Doh. Why? Because their brains haven't yet mastered this concept called conservation. The idea that the amount of something doesn't change just because it shaped us. It perfectly shows you how their logic is still under construction.
And one of the very first massive milestones happens way back in that first sensory motor stage. It's called object permanence. This is that magical moment when a baby finally gets that just because you've hidden their favorite teddy bear, it hasn't vanished from the universe. For a baby, that realization is a complete game changer. It rewrites their entire understanding of reality. All right, let's move on to our next thinker. Lawrence Kohlberg was completely fascinated by Piaget's stages, but he wanted to zoom in on one specific area. How do we figure out the difference between right and wrong? He essentially gave us a framework for our moral development. Kohlberg pictured our moral growth like we're climbing a ladder, and it has 3 main levels. At the very bottom is pre-conventional morality. It's all about me. I follow the rules so I don't get punished, or maybe so I get a cookie. Then you climb up to the middle, conventional morality. Now it's about us, the group. We obey laws and social rules because it keeps society running smoothly. And at the very, very top, you have post-conventional morality. This is where your choices are guided by your own deep, universal ethical principles, even if they go against the rules of society. Here's a super simple way to think about that first level, pre-conventional thinking. A kid might decide not to skip school, but it's not because they think education is important or that it's the right thing to do. Nope, it's just because they're scared they'll get grounded. Their entire moral calculation is based on those external consequences. Now, within these 3 levels, Kohlberg actually broke it down into 6 more detailed stages. But here's the kicker and what's so fascinating. He found that very, very few people ever make it to that final 6th stage. You know, the one based purely on universal ethics. It kind of suggests that for most of us, our moral compass stays pretty closely tied to avoiding trouble and fitting in. But what if the little scientist and the moral climber were missing a huge piece of the puzzle? Well, that's where Lev Vygotsky comes in. He looked at all this and said, hey, wait a minute. We can't understand how a mind grows without looking at the biggest influence of all, other people. Vygotsky's core idea, his whole thing, was that learning is social, deeply, fundamentally social. We don't just figure everything out on our own, locked away in our heads. We learn by talking to and working with our parents, our teachers, our friends. We're not scientists in a lab. We're more like social apprentices, learning the tools of our culture from the experts around us. And this leads us to his most famous concept, the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. I know, it sounds a little academic, but it's actually a beautiful idea. The ZPD is that sweet spot, that magical gap between what a kid can do all by themselves and what they can do with just a little bit of help. Think about learning to ride a bike. You can't do it alone at first, but with a parent holding the back of the seat, suddenly you can. That space, that gap, that's the ZPD. And Vygotsky said that's where the most important learning happens.
So this sets up a really fascinating debate. For Piaget, your biology had to come first. A child had to physically and mentally mature to a certain stage before they could learn a new complex idea. Development pulls learning along. But Vygotsky flipped that completely on its head. He said, no, it's the learning, that social interaction, that actively drives and pulls development forward. Learning is the engine, not the caboose.
So, what do we do with all this? We've got the individual scientist, the moral climber, and the social apprentice. How on earth do we put these pieces together?
Well, this table really helps bring it all into focus, doesn't it? You've got Piaget's little scientist, always building. You've got KOHLBERG's moral climber, moving up through stages of what's right and wrong. And you have Vygotsky's social apprentice, learning from the world around them. 3 really powerful metaphors to describe one incredibly complex process.
And I think the most important thing to remember here is that these aren't competing truths. It's not about Piaget versus Vygotsky. The best way to see them is as different lenses. Each one gives us a unique and vital view of the same magnificent, messy, and complex thing, a growing human mind. So I'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. When you look back at your own childhood, which one resonates the most? Do you see the curious scientist figuring things out on your own? The moral climber trying to understand the rules? Or the apprentice guided by the people you loved? You know, maybe the real answer is that we were all 3 at the same time.